Hi, Sarah.
Hey, Jean.
Welcome. Thanks for joining me for the very first live lead time chat.
I'm so glad to be here.
So Sarah, you've led mostly distributed teams for over 2 decades at 18F, O'Reilly, MailChimp, and most recently as the VP of Engineering at ConvertKit. And I'm so excited to have you as my guest for the first lead time chat because I remember reading some of your writing earlier on in the pandemic and just being really impressed with how thoughtful and nuanced your writing was around remote work. And really at a time when a lot of people it seemed like just starting to think about it because they were just thrown in for the first time. And one thing I really particularly appreciated is that rather than thinking of it as like, oh, there's a pandemic, now we're forced to go remote and hybrid, and then now we're going to be forced back into the office. I saw something you wrote somewhere that really reframed it as like, this is a great opportunity to move out of our kind of autopilot norms of in-person offices and really more intentionally decide like, how do we want to work together? So maybe to start us off, what do you see as some of the biggest opportunities to shake up some of these norms that we've just accepted because they've always been true for in-person workplaces?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to just reframe this a little bit to note that we're all talking right now about hybrid offices and what this changes. And in fact, in many companies, we've had hybrid offices for decades in that people have worked in satellite offices around the country and around the world for years. So in some way, we might want to just bring down the temperature on this a little bit. I think it's a great conversation to have. I love talking about this, and we'll go into some detail today. But I think it's also worth noting that there's a little bit of anxiety today, and we may be able to just sort of take a step beyond that by noting this is not very new. It's actually pretty old. And so there's probably some things we can learn from our own companies or our own past experiences with satellite offices.
Good point. It's not like this totally unprecedented, never explored area.
Exactly. So that said, I think one of the things that, as you noted, that the opportunity that we have is the pandemic has changed lots of people's day-to-day work and has raised lots of questions about how we can work together when we're not co-present all the time and we're not in the same location. And I think particularly in terms of meetings, there's 3 things to consider. Meetings do 3 things for us. They help us establish personal connections, they let us share info, and they help us make decisions. And some meetings do all of those things, and some meetings do a combination or just one of them. But when we are now being really intentional about how we're holding meetings and why and what we're who's involved and what we're trying to do with them, being aware that we have a couple of different implicit goals is really important and can help us make really explicit decisions about how we want to work together and what we want to get out of them. And I will note that for many people, sharing information is something that you can do asynchronously, sometimes even more effectively than you can in a meeting. But the personal connection and decisions are things that you probably want to optimize for in your meetings.
Mm-hmm. So when you have these implicit goals, what do you recommend to people? Is it to make those more explicit now that we're trying to do it intentionally?
Yeah, well, I think in particular for leaders, one of the opportunities is to have explicit conversations and with your teams, with either other leaders that you work with or the teams that you're leading, to talk about what are the goals? What are we trying to do when we are connecting with each other, when we're collaborating, whether it's synchronously or asynchronously, and brainstorm a little bit some of the ways that you can meet those goals that might be different from the ways you've done them in the past. And one of the opportunities we have now is to say, let's experiment. We have lots of new possibilities right now. Let's open things up and set up some experiments. So we can say, we know that we want to connect with each other more personally. So for the next 3 weeks, at the start of every meeting, we're going to have a personal check-in of some kind. And then after 3 weeks, we're going to put a date in the calendar and say, how did that go? Did that work for us? Do we feel more connected? Are we working any better together because we're a little more aware of each other personally? And you can make decisions whether to continue or not. Obviously, 3 weeks isn't the magic number. You pick a time, but saying we're going to try some things that we think are going to meet some goals we have, and then assessing whether they've worked. That's like a possibility that we have now. That's a little harder to come by when you're just working kind of day to day.
Yeah, I think the 3 weeks is not it's not the silver bullet, but the experiment, I think, is in some ways. I think Kate Houston wrote a post for Lead Dev around like, people really feel overwhelmed when they think about, oh, we're adding process, we're changing the process. And it was just a tip. I know you've given that tip, and Kate as well, of just call it an experiment, and you'll be blown away by how many people are just like, oh, okay, like we'll try it out and see how it goes.
Exactly. I will add to that. I think one of the important things with the experiment is you've an agreed on date that you're checking in. That is saying, is this experiment working or not? Otherwise, it feels to everybody like you're just trying to like make a backdoor change.
You're just calling it an experiment.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So what are some of the norms that you've seen in person? I know you've worked with hybrid teams for a long time, but maybe talking to other people, what are some of the norms that we don't even really think about intentionally because people have just had them for so long in in-person workspaces that could use a bit of revisiting right now?
Yeah, well, I do think it's certainly common that people get together in order to share information, when sometimes that can be done better in writing asynchronously. Of course, there's also a norm for lots of people, the sense that either their coworkers aren't working hard if they can't see them, or they feel like they aren't being assessed properly if they aren't being seen. And so one of the important things in any situation where you're not all in the same place all the time is to have some new norms around how you assure each other and trust that you are working on the things you've agreed on.
Yeah, a visibility problem, like out of sight, out of mind, and how will anyone know what I've been doing?
Yeah. I mean, of course, for the most part, certainly in tech companies and in all kinds of knowledge work, the fact of being in front of your laptop is not actually the work. What you do on it is the work, which is what we want to focus on, what you're delivering, rather than the like physical approximation of doing nothing.
Right. So, almost everyone's been working remotely, or some people are going back into an office now, but from the conversations you've been having, or maybe if you think back to when you first started working with remote teams or hybrid teams, what are some of the biggest challenges you've been seeing or hearing about?
Yeah, so there's probably three big ones here. One is that people lack personal connection when we don't see each other in person ever. It really does start to make a difference. And for some people, they were used to seeing folks either every day or a couple times a week. Sometimes it was you'd see your coworkers monthly or quarterly, depending on the setup of your offices. But not seeing each other ever is hard. And that's something that we can pay attention to in the future as we're having more opportunities to see each other. I would say the second thing is that it's hard to collaborate on certain kinds of work, particularly generative work that needs some real focus and attention, like strategic planning, for example.
Yeah.
There's a reason that teams come together to do that sort of thing, or go to have an offsite for that sort of work, that you need a long chunk of time usually to spend some time together and explore things. That's much harder to do online, in part because nobody wants to be in like a 6-hour meeting on Zoom. That's not helpful. But there are cues that we get from each other in person that are really important in that kind of work, and we're lacking those. So we have to figure out how we account for that. And then I would say finally, what we were just talking about, the issue of trust, that there are certainly managers who don't trust reports they can't see. And that's something we have to figure out as well. So those three things I think are probably the biggies in terms of challenges with work where we're not all co-present at the same time.
For the last one, have you found any effective ways to like shift the mindset of those people to not think of it as like, well, if I can't see them, they're not doing work, and kind of boosting the trust on those teams?
Yeah, I mean, the argument I usually want to have on that is, you probably don't trust that everybody else is getting work done because you don't work that effectively remotely, but that doesn't mean that everybody else is. But that's sort of irrelevant. Like, people don't tend that tend to bite on that one. I think the much more effective thing to do is to say directly, like, that you can recognize that either if you are the report or if you're the manager, that there's like a fear or a risk that not being in person means that we can't see each other, and that means some of us might feel like everybody else isn't working hard. What do we need to demonstrate in order for everybody to be comfortable, and have some agreements about whether that means having a daily note of like, here are the things that I'm going to work on today, or here are the things I did work on today, or it's weekly, or there's some system. If you're an engineer and you're working in sprints or cycles where you're committing code, that's like, it's evident what you are doing, but lots of other knowledge work can be demonstrated because there are outputs that we all care about. There's writing that you do, or systems that you're setting up, and having some agreements about when we check in on those and how we demonstrate that the work is getting done, rather than that we demonstrate that we're sitting in front of the laptop. And again, just being explicit, I think, is really what makes the biggest difference. And that's another area for experimentation. We can say, let's try this for a month and then check in and see if it's helped build trust that the work is getting done, and that if we can share a vision for how we demonstrate work.
Yeah, I imagine, trying to have some empathy for these leaders, but like, I imagine it's a pretty scary time, right? Because the way they've managed and the way that they've led has worked for a really long time, and suddenly employees are not wanting to kind of opt into that model anymore. And so, they may have been a reasonable, or, got by and with their management style in a like more traditional environment. And now they're kind of being forced to reassess, if I can't see people, like, how do I know that work is getting done?
Yeah. And I think one sort of risk we run right now is that as offices are likely to open in the next 6 months or so, it's a little hard to know, of course, when it's different in different places. But lots of managers are more effective in person because they're in meetings most of the time and they prefer to meet in person. And lots of meetings are, in fact, better in person. So for a lot of managers, I think it looks like, oh, offices are opening and we should all go back to the office. We will all be most effective. But one of the things that's come out in the pandemic is that although there are some people who feel very strongly that they want to be in the office all the time, especially people with young kids often really want to be in the office a lot, or people who manage and meet a lot. And there are some people who want to be in the office never. There's like some polar opposites. The majority of people want to be in the office sometimes and want to work from home sometimes. And so for managers who are very strongly at one end or the other, being able to recognize that almost everybody else needs some combination and setting up your systems to account for that, that's going to be pretty key.
Yeah, I think it, like, people, what I've been hearing is like, especially younger folks, like that's where their social scene is in the office. And so they go, they move to a city, they want to go into the office. I thankfully have a separate studio, so my kids aren't around, but yeah, I absolutely think there's going to be a pretty widespread. And I guess one question I have is like, there's a lot of different models for hybrid teams, right? They're sort of like, work wherever you want. Like some people are in the office a few days a week, but then I've also been hearing about a more synchronized hybrid model where either the whole company is in 3 days a week, or different teams are in different days of the week. Like I'm a Monday, Wednesday team, or I'm a Tuesday, Friday team. And then maybe those teams never see each other in office, but they're there with their teams whenever they're in office. In your experience, have you found any specific models to work better or be more effective at setting teams up for success?
Yeah, so it's pretty different by company is one of the things I would say. It depends a lot on the culture of the company and also who's employed. Is it a lot of people with young kids or young people who want to be in the office a fair amount? Is it more like middle-aged people and everyone just wants to be home all the time? I think
those are some strong stereotypes.
I know it is, but also there were some really strong trends that we saw in the pandemic, which I think has been interesting. I would say again, not to beat this drum too hard, but this is an area that's ripe for experimentation. I do think giving people some flexibility to the things that I've seen be most successful are companies where you can make a choice and the systems are set up so you can be in the office most days if you want, or work from home most days, but there are agreements about when you come in. So whether you have team days that are Monday, Wednesdays, or the whole company is basically on site a couple of days a week, or the whole company is, you make a choice a couple of days a week. But the other days when it's not mandated that people have some flexibility, that seems to me like the most successful, because it accounts for where people are most productive, but also says we know that we need some time that we all are together, or some sets of us are together, and we've accounted for both of those things.
Yeah, I love coming back to the idea of experimentation. I don't remember where I saw this, but someone was saying that they hope that they could actually have meeting days at home and then actually come into the office when they don't have meetings. So then they can just kind of have that time for casual social interaction, which is not something I would have thought of, but I could imagine trying that out for like 2 weeks or something and seeing how that goes.
Yeah.
'Cause it could be unexpected results.
Totally, that's really interesting. And I think that's also to the idea of people who have a lot of distraction at home might feel like you wanna, like you can, you've got like a situation where you could, lots of distraction home, but you can close that off. And so it might be that what you want is to meet from home, but going into an office gives you a chance to connect with people in a more casual way. That makes a lot of sense. And as you said, it's like a good fodder for experimentation.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about meetings already, and meetings, are one of the main ways that people communicate all about their work. And I'm, happy to see that more and more companies are exploring async tools as well. I know you have a lot of thoughts about this. What are some of the best practices you can recommend for remote or hybrid meetings to make sure, just whenever not everyone is co-located, what are some best practices you can recommend to make sure that everyone really feels like they're included equally in the meeting?
Yeah. So I have a few technical recommendations, and then like one strong social one. So the main thing I would say technically is, again, if we think about in a previous era when we had hybrid satellite offices, you had people who were working in offices in different places. It was pretty common that you were on conference calls all the time where you couldn't see each other, but you could hear each other really well. And so I would strongly recommend that people think very hard about having very good audio in the rooms where there are people together. And instead of spending all of your time and energy trying to figure out like video setups where people who aren't in the room can see everybody, make sure you've got audio so they can hear everybody, and then have everybody in the room on their laptop video. And so everyone who's not in the room can see the faces of all the people. You turn off the audio on your laptop. You've shared good audio in the room. And you may, if you're not in the room, not be able to see exactly who's sitting next to whom, but you'll be able to see everybody's faces and they'll be able to see yours. And that combination of shared audio, individual video, for even a fairly large number of people, can make a hybrid meeting work extremely well, and allows for the people who aren't in the room to participate quite fully. There are a couple of caveats to that. One is that, of course, sometimes it's harder to concentrate when your laptop is open. Good practice there is like turn off your notifications. And everyone has to be an adult about that and figure out those things. But that's worth doing in order to make sure that, meetings are expensive. It's in time and in money. And in order to make sure you're getting good value out of those, make the sacrifice of turning off your notifications and having a full screen of the video that's happening. In addition, depending on the size of the meeting, if it's bigger than a few people, you might want to have a designated person on site who can troubleshoot, or people who aren't on site can DM and say there's a problem here, the audio isn't working as we expected, or like the internet has gone out and they're texting the person and can let them know we can't, see or hear in some way. Or maybe there's like a whiteboard that's being used and you do need a camera on that or something, and the camera needs to be adjusted. So having someone on site who can help with those things, especially for larger meetings, can be really valuable, and that person's designated. And I would say those are probably the main technical things. Sort of you've got shared audio, everybody has individual video, you've got a person who's designated for troubleshooting. And then there's two social things that are really important. So one is that the person who's leading the meeting checks in with the people who aren't there, is very intentional about asking for participation from the people who aren't in the room. And just making sure everybody is included. And that's a real signal about including people, but it's also practically, you'll get more voices in the room. And then earlier I noted that one of the reasons that we have meetings is for personal connection. The company where I work now, ConvertKit, does an interesting thing. In most recurring meetings, and I would say meetings of like 8 or fewer people, we start every meeting with a check-in, a red, yellow, green check-in, which is how are you doing on a scale red, yellow, green. And although it sounds kind of mushy, and when I first got there, I was like, this seems like it's going to take a lot of time, it actually pays off hugely. One, we feel more connected to each other, but just on a business level, being aware that somebody's having a bad day, either for personal reasons, and people can talk about why they're having a good or a bad day, why they're orange, why they're sage. And it might be personal reasons and it might be work reasons, or they might just say, I'm having I'm red and I can't talk about it today. But knowing that means that when they drop a note in Slack and they're kind of like short about it, or they aren't as responsive as you expect, or they aren't inclusive in the ways that they usually are, you know what's up, and you don't have to spend time wondering and worrying if they're angry about something or if there's some subtext to that. And instead, you can spend your time making sure that everybody else knows that we have to ask some like particular questions here, or give this person a beat, and invest in the things that you can keep moving forward on a business level. And I have to say, it actually is, it paid off tremendously, I think, for us personally and as a business. And like red, yellow, green isn't the only way to do that. Of course, there's many ways to have that sort of check.
Yeah, we do the same thing, and we check in on range where you choose red, yellow, green, and then you actually choose an emoji too. And so you can see people's moods throughout the day, whether or not you're in meetings with them. But it's funny because sometimes people will, be yellow in their morning check-in, and then I'll see them in a meeting and they're like, oh, now I'm trending green. And so you kind of just get some of that like ambient context that you might get more implicitly in an office, just like seeing how people's, body language is, how their energy is. But when you don't even see them, it's just nice to kind of know how people are doing. And I really like that it's so lightweight, because it's easier to say, oh, I'm red, but I don't want to talk about it, than like go into like, oh, I had a really awful weekend, this drama, like all that. So
yeah, exactly. I love the emoji piece to like shore that up too.
Yeah. I also really liked your emphasis on the audio, because I think one of the concerns I've heard is like, oh, it's going to be really expensive to set up all this like VC, like video conference equipment. And then Google had that New York Times piece with the like huge, like full size TVs. I'm like, I don't want to be that big on a screen. Right. Like there's just, so I appreciate the kind of like simpler and just like, here's what's important, here's what to focus on. You don't need to invest, tens of thousands of dollars in upgrading an office that your team is maybe only there 2 days a week at.
Yeah. And I will say too, I've worked in many companies, and I would say for at least 15 years now, that had each successive generation of the fancy video in the conference room. And every time it doesn't work consistently, and it takes a while to set it up, and people are reluctant to be on giant screens. And I assume there is a future in which that stuff will work seamlessly, but we are not there yet. And it's both an investment of money, but also time in a meeting to make sure it's working every time. And so for most meetings that you have, that's not the way to spend your time. Just like hop on your Zoom screens, and I mean, your laptop screens on Zoom, and you've solved the problem.
Yeah. Another concern I've heard a lot of, or I think people even just maybe accept that this is going to be the case, is that when people go back to an office, but there's going to be like people who come in a few days a week, and then there's people who are remote pretty much full time. that those remote employees will kind of be like second-class citizens. They may not get promotions as often. They may miss out on like lunch or coffee chats with, executives or higher ups. And in your experience, like, what does it take to combat drifting into that pattern and be more intentional about equity?
Yeah. I've worked for a few companies that had that kind of a setup where some of the people were in the office most of the time and some of the people were in the office just about never. And in the places that I've worked that have done that well, where it has been basically a non-issue, people have been intentional of saying, we want to make sure that this isn't a problem. So among the things that you do are, this is true for in-person companies too, make sure you have good management, in the sense that your manager should be having regular one-on-ones with folks to understand what they're doing, where they're challenged, where they need help and visibility. It also means being intentional about who's presenting and who's running meetings and who's demoing new work that you've done, and making sure that that rotates to the people who are not in the office as well, that we don't just default and say all the meetings have to be run by somebody who's in the office or all the demos are done live. And again, like, this is a sort of thing that even for in-person companies, you want to be intentional about this. And like, you bring those skills to your hybrid companies as well. But I think too, it's worth noting that if you are in a hybrid situation and you start to find that people who are remote are not getting the same kinds of career attention, then you need to do some diagnosis for your company. Does your company have a really strong culture of people going out to drinks and building relationships? And if so, does that mean that you need to have some kinds of, like, people do come in occasionally, whether that's on a quarterly basis and it's for relationship building, or they're coming in one day a week, and maybe, as you said before, it's less for formal meetings and more for chat time. And so they set up coffees and lunches and things when they're in the office. Or you could find that people aren't being promoted because people are less aware of their work, and then you need better systems for awareness of work. You have to diagnose that on your company level. And you can have some hypotheses before you start, so you can try to put things in place, but you have to just keep an eye on who's getting attention and getting promoted when, and making sure you're adjusting appropriately.
Yeah, absolutely. This reminds me of, I was once managing a team that had like one person in the New York office. And when that person came in for, a week, maybe every 6 months or something, they were like, whoa, like, this is so different. Like, I'm hearing all this stuff. I know what's going on. And it was kind of a plus to be in the kind of HQ because of those reasons, but also they were like grateful to go back to New York where they didn't have all these distractions. But sometimes that contrast of what happens when someone is, where most of the people are, like how different is it, can kind of help you diagnose where there are gaps, right? Because like ideally you come in and be like, oh, this is not that different. Like, I still feel like I am getting the same information, not like, wow, I'm really missing out working at the other office.
You bring up a great point here, Jean, which is something I've seen everywhere I've ever worked that had satellite offices or remote employees or a combination. And that's that wherever the headquarters is the place where there's the highest, like, fever pitch of activity. People are really aware of usually what the execs are doing. They can see them in rooms with each other. They can see them in rooms with other people, or they're like in the coffee chat, like in the coffee area chatting with your boss, and they're laughing, and maybe they're laughing about you. People get really focused on how the execs are behaving in a headquarters environment. And it leads to like a lot of politics and gossip and conversation that can be really distracting. And one of the things that's almost always true in satellite offices or for people who work from home is that that's all really muted. Like, you're not even that aware of it. And I think we have a sense that having access to the information about the way execs are behaving is valuable. But I think often it's more a distraction than it is a real value. And it may not particularly lead to people being more productive workers or bringing more value to the organization, or even being better at building relationships. In a lot of cases, I think it can be like fairly distracting and sometimes kind of distressing, because
Yeah.
there's quite a lot of focus on usually a handful of people.
Yeah, yeah. I know what that's like. I'll just leave it there. So I've always tried to be really iterative with team processes and try to address things that are active pain points so that it doesn't feel like I'm swooping in and introducing unnecessary process. But as companies, start to return to offices, if they're going to return to office, it feels like some changes may be harder later on, especially once people have like reacclimated to in-office norms. Are there any like meeting practices or considerations you think that leaders should be tackling now to set up their teams for success rather than more reactively as those pain points come up?
Yeah, I'm certainly, I would love to say, here's the things you need to, proactively like be aware will happen, but it's going to be different for every company. So I'm afraid this takes us back to the idea of experiments and being really like, I think a good principle is to start off by saying, we don't exactly know what's going to work and what we're going to need in an era where we've got people using the office in different ways, in different patterns. And so we want to try things and get everybody's input into them. And, kind of saying at the beginning, here's the way that we are going to do experiments. We're going to get input from these places. We're going to say explicitly that we have hypotheses. We're going to set timelines for things. And here's how we're going to discuss and decide what we iterate on. I think that's the sort of thing you can be practicing fully remote as well. And building that muscle is really key.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I think so basically starting to like sharing that context and then starting to experiment. If you're not already running a lot of process experiments with your team, like starting to introduce a few, getting people used to like debriefing about them and just like practicing that muscle or exercising that muscle, as you mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, one thing that people should be aware of is like, you can run one experiment a month or one a quarter, and that's still building the muscle. It doesn't have to be an overwhelming, everything is up for debate all the time. Just starting to learn how to do it is okay as well. I would add one other thing that I think is really important to think about when you're going back to the office, which is that you want to make sure that remote work or in-person work is evenly accessible. So that is to say, lots of companies want to let individual departments decide who's going to be in the office when. And one of the risks that you run with that is a really uneven distribution that's like socially inequitable. So for example, if you work in a company that decides by department and engineering decides people can work wherever they want, whenever, and white men are overrepresented in engineering, and then you decide customer success has to be in the office almost all the time, and Black women are overrepresented in customer success, you've created some inequity in accessibility of either office space or, in this case, remote work. And being really intentional as managers and leaders in thinking about how we ensure we don't have that kind of inequity, that's really important. And it's probably something to start talking about now if you aren't already.
Yeah, I have heard companies planning to do something like that, where the manager decides, or certain functions or certain teams are going to be remote. So is that a conversation? So say you're a manager at a company and this is kind of what's given to you, like, oh, you can decide. I'm an engineering manager. What kind of conversation would I then kind of go back up to, people and bring up this conversation or this discussion?
Yeah, right. So if you're not in the position to set the policy, if the policy is being given to you, there's a couple of things you can do. You can certainly raise that issue that if we all decide individually, it means that we are potentially creating problems within the company, uneven expectations, and also the issue that we may have people who cross-functionally need to meet and have very different expectations and ideas of when they need to be available. But I think kind of raising the question of equity is a good thing to do now when we've had everybody working from home, in most cases very effectively, for a long period of time, so that you have an opportunity to ask, what is it that we are optimizing for, and what have we gained in this time? What have we learned? What have we lost? And how can we be really careful about accounting for those things rather than just defaulting back to where we were, which a lot of managers will do if given the chance, and raising it in terms of the business benefits of having a policy that's fair to everybody, especially in a time when hiring is very hard. We want to really be careful across the board that we're not incentivizing employees to leave or creating resentment and bitterness potentially when we're going to have a really hard time backfilling. And I would add one other thing here too, which is you can raise things up and put it in terms of the business benefits. You can also talk to managers who are peers in other departments and try to have some alliances in how you're going to work together, or just have some very soft norms that you're going to try to create together.
Yeah, what you mentioned, it reminds me of something my manager, Dan, has mentioned a few times, which is like, a lot of these problems are not new. Like, they are problems that like accessibility to execs, right? There's often like an in-group of people who have access to execs, are kind of like buddies with the execs, or even like, you know, the inequity between engineering or product and engineering and like customer service, right? Like, I've heard of companies where they, you know, free lunch is only for product engineering, and just these problems all existed before, but I think we're being forced to intentionally choose now, and the split is more remote and in office rather than, oh, so and so is buddies with the exec, so they have more access to them.
Yeah, it's such a good point. There's so many layers of this that have existed for such a long time. And back to your first question, some of the norms that we get to question right now are whether we want those sorts of relationships that are based on like pre-existing connections or on physical proximity, whether we want those to be what we're optimized for, or how we're really making decisions.
All right, looks like we've got some key questions from the audience. So let's see. Taylor has a question. Would love to hear any ideas Sarah or Jean have about, point number 2 from a long time ago, recreating the 6-hour war room environment on a distributed team. I don't know if you said war room, but more like the, you know, strategy, like getting all together in a room and discussing strategy.
Yeah, it is hard. Like, there's no way around that. I don't want to pretend that it's not hard. A couple of things that I've seen that have been, I think, relatively effective. So if you're in a situation where you can't get everybody together because pandemic or travel costs or whatever is preventing that, generally speaking, people can go about an hour and a half and stay pretty focused on Zoom. But you can do an hour and a half a couple of times a day. So with some long breaks in between, probably a good hour, sometimes an hour and a half even in between, you can do 2 or 3 of those in a day, and you can do that a few days in a row. And partly you want to set the expectation of what you're using the time in between for. If you're using the time in between for other meetings, that you're going to be pretty depleted. But if you treat it more like an offsite and you're going to use that time in between, maybe for more reflection or some sorts of writing or things that are a little more heads down, you come back more refreshed and ready to continue in the more generative sessions. I will say too that some of the tools like FigJam or Miro, the things that are like the digital whiteboards, those can be useful, but the tools take a minute to learn. Like they're pretty intuitive, but they don't exactly work in your browser the way you're expecting. Or you download the app and then you can't figure out how to coordinate like the video screen and the app on your various screens. So one of the things that I think makes the digital whiteboarding more effective is to actually dedicate some time, and maybe it's time together, and maybe it's time ahead that everybody does individually, to learning the tools, to spending a half an hour clicking around and figuring out, how do we zoom in this? Zoom almost never works the way people expect. How do I get text onto this sticky, so that you're not spending the meeting stumbling over the tools? Because those tools, weirdly, I mean, you would think they would just work the way everybody would expect, but they don't exactly. I would find they're like 20 to 30% different than you expect, and then you're a little bit stuck. So learn those ahead, invest in that.
Yeah, I definitely have had that experience where I'm like, no, I want to move it, but I'm in like the wrong, there's like a moving state and then like a selecting state.
Yes, that, it's terrible. So like, just know what that is. And you know, one
Yeah.
thing I find is a lot of times like designers who spend a fair amount of time in those tools are much more comfortable in those meetings because they know how to use Miro or whatever you're using. They use it all the time. So getting the rest of the team kind of up to speed, so they're really like ready to go, makes a big difference.
Yeah. We've also had good success. I'm kind of what you're saying, like spreading out 1 hour, 1.5 hour things across different days. But sometimes, say it's like some sort of like brainstorming or ideation thing where we actually do want to have some time to think about it in between those meetings. And that's been really effective, of like splitting up what might have been a, full day exec strategy meeting into maybe a week, but having more time in between where it's like, okay, by next time we meet, make sure you fill this out and add your ideas. And that actually, I feel like is inclusive, more inclusive to people who don't want to be put on the spot of like, you have 5 minutes with these Post-it notes, like write down all your ideas, and just having a bit of time to like wait till you're wanting to ideate.
Yeah, totally. And one of the ways you can make that work is to schedule that time, to say like, the offsite is going to be the first, I don't know, let's call it 3 hours of the day, every day for 4 days, but you're only going to meet for the first hour and a half. And then the expectation is you're going to be doing some reflection in the other time, but then you don't have meetings booked into that, or other like administrative you have to do.
Yeah, because sometimes I look at other people's calendars, I'm like, I don't know when you're going to be able to get to this. I hope it's not, 9 p.m.
Exactly.
Okay. Oh, this is a good one. What has worked well for engaging introverted team members?
Yeah, that's so interesting, because one of the things that I find is that a lot of times introverted team members are more comfortable in Zoom meetings or in hybrid meetings than in person. But I think this is one of those questions that's sort of the same in a remote situation or distributed, and that is in person, which is you can either or both have meeting norms where you do round robin. For example, any major question, everybody in the room, you go around the room and check in with everybody in the room. And that's like a meeting norm for your company or a particular recurring meeting. Or the leader makes sure to check in with everybody, and especially to solicit input from people who might be a little bit quiet or aren't given to participating. Now, I answered that question as if the person meant introverted as not participating that much, rather than introverted as like really depleted by a lot of meetings. And if the question was more like you're depleted by a lot of meetings, I do think that's sort of back to what we were talking about at the top of kind of being intentional about what you're using meetings for. And if you wind up having a lot of meetings that are about sharing information, it's worth questioning whether we need did this meeting need to be a meeting?
Right.
Can we share information in a different form?
Yeah. I mean, I'm pretty far on the introverted side of the introvert extrovert spectrum, but that's not that I don't have ideas and thoughts. It's mostly just that I'm less willing to interrupt people and like speak over people to share my ideas. And so what you're saying of like having some structure, some norms of going round robin, or one thing that we often do is like, we'll set it, or like, here, think about this reflection prompt. We're each going to share about it afterwards. set a timer for 30 seconds or a minute, and then people know that they have to share something. And you wouldn't get that if you're just like, anyone have any thoughts? It might be like one more loud person in the room will share their thoughts, and everyone will be like, oh, I don't want to take up space here.
Totally. And I mean, actually one really nice, I love that idea of like, everybody takes a minute to reflect and then go around. But I think also a nice norm with Zoom is you're muted unless you want to say something. And so you can unmute when somebody else is talking as a signal that I want to speak up, but you don't have to interrupt them in order to actually say something.
Yeah, that's a norm that would be, I guess, the in-person first would be like raise your hand or something, but that's
Right.
a little bit,
I know, but it's so
like
funny.
you're in
I now
school or
hear
something.
people say that, exactly. But I hear people
Yeah.
say that all the time now, that they don't have the tool of like unmuting
Yeah.
themselves in
Like a little
person. How
flag or
are we going to
something.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
Wave a little flag.
Yeah. Okay. We can probably do a few more. Let me see. Oh, this is a good one. Any thoughts on ways to help new grad or interns or junior engineers grow in a remote environment? I feel like much of this in the before times happened from proximity to experienced engineers.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I hear that one a lot. So I currently work for a completely remote company, and I have a couple of other times. And one of the things that we found is that having a lot of scheduled pairing time and time for just asking questions, again, that's scheduled, is really key. It opens up, it sends a signal to say, we care about investing in your development. And it means that people are putting time into that as well. But there's lots of other things that you can do that help make it safe for people to ask lots of questions, and make sure that they're getting good information and getting good prompts. So you can have help channels where people can ask. You can have very strong norms around like no dumb questions. And that can be like replicated by leaders, can ask things publicly that might feel a little bit awkward to ask. And people are quick and generous in answering, makes a big difference in creating a relatively safe environment. Having some kind of structure for giving people feedback. So pairing and answering questions are kind of inputs, but you also want to say like, oh, how's this going? Making sure that they're getting reviewed, and having some structure for that, whether that's scheduled time with their manager or with other ICs who can help kind of say, here's some, did you consider this? You might have done this in a different way. Try this in the future. That's a little bit of a different thing than we're building this together right now. And so setting those kinds of touch points as well makes a pretty big difference.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think this is something that I imagine a lot of engineering teams, and probably not just engineering, because I feel like, new grads, if their first job out of school, like they don't know what the norm is, right? And they, I feel like a lot of school is like, do it yourself. Like it's better if you do it yourself. Like you do it yourself, you're autonomous. And so, yeah, I think like, I see it as like two different, like both the managers coaching people to figure out like, what are you stuck on? Like, how long do you wait? Like, I've heard of people who are like, oh, I exhaust all my ideas before I ask anyone. I'm like, that could take days, like you could have a lot of ideas, like don't do that. And so like coaching people to reduce their internal barrier to asking for help, but then also the team processes need to also meet them in the middle. And so just, I think that's a challenging one that a lot of people are facing.
That's such a good example too about, I just exhaust all, like have a norm that you should spend 15 minutes on a thing and then you ask somebody for help.
Right. Or like someone, I've heard of someone who's like, oh, I just grew up thinking that it would be better for me to figure it out myself, even if it takes longer. Like that's probably something that, like, I mean, I heard my brother telling his kid, I was like, don't tell him that. He's like, figure it out yourself, this is life. I'm like, no, like you're not setting him up for success.
Yeah. And the company probably doesn't want you spending all of your time figuring out something that somebody else could answer quickly or help you point you in the right direction.
Right, absolutely. I think this is, as you said, leaders can ask the, dumb or the basic questions in the public Slack channel and kind of model that behavior. I think we could probably take one more. Let's see. Oh, this is a good one. For hiring and onboarding, are there any successful strategies for building or for quickly building personal connections and trust in an entirely distributed company? More meetings seems inefficient and very draining.
Yeah, it is true. More meetings are draining. There's no way around that. And also you have to meet a lot of people at the beginning, and there'll be a bunch of Zoom meetings to meet folks. I do think that one of the things that's hard is that building trust is slow pretty much anywhere, even in person. It's slow. And the way that people usually build trust is by either jointly, like taking risks together and bearing the outcomes of that, or by seeing other people and themselves deliver work value to your company in whatever your environment is. So if you're a manager, one of the things that you can think about is how you set up new hires to be able to deliver some small things pretty quickly, so that other people can see the value they can bring, and they can see that. They can feel like, oh, I am contributing here, and can build on that. If you don't have that kind of guidance from a manager, taking that approach to early days of you don't want to be like too aggressive and randomly do things just to prove yourself, but thinking about what are some of the small things I can take on so I can figure out, is this valuable? Am I getting good feedback? Am I building relationships by working on something that's relatively small and quick? Quick could be a lot of different things, but that's probably a smart way to start to build the relationships you need and the ambient sense that you're going to be working for the same goals that everybody else has.
Yeah, I think like when people say build trust, sometimes people are like, oh, I'm a trustworthy person, but that's not quite the same thing, right? It's like building credibility that, you can deliver, that when I give you something, you can own it and drive it to completion. In terms of personal connections, we've started using Donut, which I know a lot of companies use, just to pair people up for some casual coffee chats. And that's been really good for like between teams, because like I think engineering sees a lot of each other, but we don't see as much of like marketing and customers teams. So that's been really nice.
Yeah, we used that at MailChimp too, and it was helpful.
Yeah. It's like a very, very simple, but I think a lot of companies have found it to be really useful. All right, let's take one more. So Tessa asked, what are the trade-offs for redistributing work so work groups are co-located versus having work groups span multiple sites? And how do you decide how to distribute work, taking those trade-offs into account?
Not sure I understand the question.
I think it's like, do you redistribute work so that like, this set of people who are in, say, an SF office, they can work together versus having more work groups distributed or not co-located?
Yeah, got it. Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I think one of the things that is almost always true is that companies often try to say like this whole department, all of product will be in the San Francisco office, or this cross-functional team will all be in the New York office. And that works for like 2 months. And then somebody
except
moves.
This specific person.
Exactly. Or then, someone moves or you hire somebody, or there's somebody who can't be in that place. And so you make an exception. And so the reality is often that teams wind up distributed even when you make an attempt to have them co-located. So it's smart to set up your systems so that you can have that you've got some norms where people will be able to work not in person. But it's also totally, I think, a real value to think about if you have a concentration of people or a satellite office in one area. What's the strategic value of having them all together? Like, are there do you want to have a concentration of product people in San Francisco, because there's lots of folks you can hire there who have a specific kind of expertise that you want? Or do you want to build a certain kind of culture in one office that might extend to other offices, like an office where you've got a fair number of senior people who can really mentor more junior people, and they're going to bring some educational value to the whole organization and help you figure out how to do that. So thinking about what strategic value an individual office or group of people can bring, I think is super valuable, even if everybody can't be in person all the time, or you wind up with the individual teams being distributed much of the time.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Sarah. It's obvious you have a wealth of knowledge with distributed teams, and I'm so grateful that you can share that with all of us today.
Shane, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what everybody does in the coming years with all kinds of new hybrid setups that we can learn from.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks.